My guest today is award-winning game designer and writer Rodin D.
Welcome to Dicegeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is Dicegeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt and I am your host. This is the RPG podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. My name is Matt Davids. It is my privilege to bring you an awesome guest each and every week on this podcast. So if you never want to miss an episode, be sure to subscribe wherever you are listening. Now, guys, I am on a quest, and that quest is to bring you the coolest game designers, writers, filmmakers, historians, whatever it takes to take us to the next level in our role playing. And today is no different. I have an amazing guest today. Let's just jump right in. My guest today is the award-winning game designer behind Drama System and Gumshoe, in addition to being the co-host of the Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff podcast, Rodin D. Robin, welcome to the show.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
You're most welcome.
Well, I like to ask my guests when they're first on the show, how were you introduced to role-playing games?
I was aware of role-playing as a young teenage science fiction fan in the 70s reading Analog magazine because they had ads for this thing called Dungeons and Dragons. And it was never clear exactly how that worked. And it sort of seemed to suggest that it was both a story and a game, which seemed both intriguing and confusing to me. With another friend and I who had similar interests, we actually wound up ordering some of the mini games from metagaming, like Chitin, which are more like a war games. It's little flimsy cardboard war games in this case, where you played bugs fighting each other. And that wasn't exactly our speed. Or we tried the Starship Troopers war game from Avalon Hill, and that also was not, it was a little too complicated and fiddly. And then finally I was on vacation with my family, and we were in the sort of a colonial, might have been Colonial Williamsburg or somewhere like that, someplace down in the States that we were visiting as a family in our motorhome. And in a gift shop down in the basement, there was a small hobby section where I saw on the shelf Blue Box D&D. And I convinced my dad to buy it and open it up. And so we were driving down the highway in the motorhome, and I was trying to figure out exactly how it worked. And I opened up the box, and it's like, oh, it seems like it's partly a game and partly a story, and I don't quite get it, but I'll keep going and figure it out. And so finally, I did figure it out. And with the captive audience of my brother, who is quite young at the time, he's 5 years younger than I am, and my dad, I ran them through a beginning dungeon. My dad got killed by a carrion crawler. That was the end of his interest in role-playing. And it really wasn't until I got home after the vacation and called up my friend and said, I got this game while I was away called Dungeons and Dragons. Are you interested? He said, I've been waiting my whole life for someone to ask me this. So we got roped in a few other semi-promising prospects, and we got going playing D&D. And by that time, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was mostly out. This was the point where the Dungeon Master's Guide hadn't quite come out, but the Monster Book and the Player's Handbook were out, and we got going based on that. And in one way or another, role-playing has been part of my life ever since.
I would probably be safe to assume that like role-playing game designer wasn't on the list of your career choices when you were kind of starting out.
No, I always wanted to be a writer. Initially, like in grade 4, I thought comic book writer, which weirdly enough I wound up doing for a little while. Then I was interested in possibly writing for the theater, but I never really thought of role-playing as an actual outlet for paid writing work, let alone a career, until later when I got involved with an amateur press association called the Alarms and Excursions, and through that wound up getting in touch in various ways with Jonathan Tweet, who had then, when I first heard of him, he and Mark Reinhagen were creating whimsy cards, So I wound up collaborating with him on what became Over the Edge. I was also contacted by Steve Jackson Games to turn the weirdo tribal role-playing setting into a GURPS that I was writing about in Alarms and Excursions. I wound up turning that into a GURPS book. And before I knew it, my word was getting out and people were contacting me to write for them. And within a couple of years, I was doing it full-time. And ever since then, I've been a full-time writer. And for most of that time, role-playing or role-playing related things have been the bulk of my work, although I've written a lot of fiction. And like I said, I briefly wrote for Marvel Comics. But so who knew this could be a job? I didn't at the time.
Now, I asked Matt Forbeck this question when I interviewed him. Does it make you sick to your stomach when guys like me call themselves writers?
I think envy is a trait of other people who aren't satisfied with what they've done yet. So certainly there are people with different levels of accomplishment. And the thing about role-playing, particularly now, since you can publish your own stuff, the barriers to entry are very low. And so I would couch that in a very different way, which is to encourage people to work on the fundamentals. If you are imaginative, that's important, but it's not the most important thing. If you are disciplined, that's very important. If you write to spec and deliver on time, which can mean delivering on time for your Kickstarter audience now, or for just the people who are interested in your stuff. But you have to be prolific and disciplined and work a lot, and also work on your writing fundamentals. And if you do all of those things, I and other people who are already established need you as collaborators. So at Pelgrane, for example, we're always on the lookout for new writers, particularly writers who come from life perspectives that are not typically addressed in gaming so far. And we're anxious to find new people who are calling themselves writers. But it's even better when they have the fundamentals in place to be able to deliver on that.
Touched on a few topics there that I was going to kind of follow up with, that kind of your thoughts on self-publishing. So you look at kind of the self-publishing revolution on a whole as a good thing?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole thing about role-playing in the first place is that the divide between audience and art maker is erased, right? That when you sit down and play a role-playing game, you are creating art. And you're creating art largely for yourself and for a small group of other people, which now, in a new weird vista, has gone back to becoming a passive entertainment through Twitch and YouTube. And weirdly, once you make it a passive entertainment, it becomes wildly more popular. Yeah. Who'd have thunk that? But anyway, it's always been an I've got a barn, I've got some costumes, let's put on an art form situation. And so that's all to the good that people are jumping in and doing it. It's a participatory art form. And the more opportunities there are for people to do things and to find an audience, the better. I think it's great that role-playing is still largely it's not non-hierarchical, but it's a largely flat structure. And when there starts to be real big-time money in it, that's when the sharks will come in. That's when the guys with the suits who say, how do we take all of the money that should go to creators and put it in our pockets? And also, let's make this stupid and more compromised, and let's insert our dumb ideas into the pot and make the creators suffer our notes as well. So it's all part of the what I think we will later look back on as a golden age of creativity, and something that I think in a lot of ways prefigured the entire culture of the internet. That role-playing gaming was already participatory before the technology existed for that to fully come into place. And so something like Alarms and Excursions, which was a fanzine that everybody submitted their own little chunks to, including comments on other people's things, was basically an analog version of a Discord channel.
Kind of in my own experience, it was just that playing role-playing games and running games that I think about so much material and I end up creating so much material. To me, I was thinking, self-publishing could just be a little outlet. So some of these things maybe will help other people, and then turned into my career. So, which was, surprising to me. But I mean, it could only happen due to the technology and the ease of self-publishing these days. And then I am also with you on the passive form of entertainment that people will actually listen and watch to other people play role-playing games. I did not see that one coming at all.
Yes, it ruined a thing that I always said, which was, again, that there's no division between audience and art maker in role-playing, and now there is. People are comfortable with that.
Because just in my personal experience over the years playing since, I started playing when I was 9, just playing, especially when I was a teenager, somebody would always say, oh, their girlfriend or their brother or somebody wants to come and watch, but they don't want to play. And I would always just be like, no, they have to play. Like, bring them. Sure. Let's play. Because watching is no fun, but, watching's fun now. Still talking about writing a little bit before we move on. I have written a little bit about this myself online, and of course I got some pushback about it because the internet or whatever. But
are you saying that people have opinions on the internet?
Oh, well, maybe, and sometimes strong ones, I guess. But
I'm glad to break some news on the podcast.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, everybody. Yeah, newsflash for everybody listening. Yeah, especially if you can hide behind a screen name, the opinions seem to be stronger, I think. But I had wrote about that reading and watching a lot of books and a lot of movies actually helps you become a better writer, and in turn will actually help you become a better game master. And like I said, I got a little pushback on that. I would like to hear your opinion on that. Do you think that reading widely helps you become...
Are you saying that people were arguing you don't need to be familiar with the art forms you're working in?
Yes. Yes, I am.
And we have to seriously address that thesis? Good grief. You don't need to eat a muffin before you make a muffin recipe. That's so the entire basis of my design is that role-playing is an art form, and that it is good to look at the ways that similar events in other similar genres in other forms are handled, and to see what we can steal from that to make it more interesting. So I think that the idea that you don't need to read to become a writer, that you don't need to watch movies in order to steal their narrative tricks, or I guess to become a filmmaker, it's such an absurd proposition that I'm not sure how to begin to tackle it.
I have to agree, because I just didn't even know what to say. I think there was some ideas that just reading doesn't teach you about story structure somehow, or well,
it doesn't. If the argument is it's not enough to just read,
okay,
that you also have to analyze and understand. But I don't think that's the argument. So
no, it wasn't. Yeah, I found it hard to address that as well, and because I always tried to use examples of showing people who, some of the great writers, some of the great filmmakers that I think a lot of people would be shocked about how much, say, a writer like J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, how many books they actually read, and how many films that, say, Steven Spielberg or Martin Scorsese have actually watched, that you would just be shocked with the sheer volume of how many of those films that they have watched and then analyzed, of course.
Well, and as if you're ever in the business of looking at the work of prospective writers in order to decide whether you want to work with them or not, it's pretty apparent who doesn't read very much or who just reads garbage on the internet. If you want to have a pro style, you've got to read a ton of stuff and assimilate that, and have it be a bunch of disparate stuff too, right? It's not just enough, if you want to be a fantasy writer, for example, to only read Tolkien and Leiber and Moorcock. You should be reading literary fiction as well, and fiction in other genres, and lots of nonfiction. And you need to know a lot of stuff as well. So the idea that you can become an accomplished writer, even people who are best-selling writers of stuff that is regarded as garbage but is nonetheless popular, are voracious readers, and you can tell that by the skill with which they deploy the popular cliches that distinguish their work. So are there any other nonsense opinions you'd like me to dismiss on a premise level at this point?
Well, I just wanted somebody to back me up, so I feel better. If I can think of a few other nonsense ones, yeah, I'll throw them your way. As I was saying too, I think that reading and watching kind of widely also help you become a better game master, because you're essentially sitting at the table telling a story. And if you're not familiar with some of these things, and a multitude of story. To me, it just doesn't seem like, where's it going to come from? What are you going to draw from?
Yeah.
And,
Well, to support that argument, I should write an entire book. Oh, wait, I already have.
okay.
It's called Hamlet's Hit Points.
Yes.
And the whole point of that book is to take a look at the way that narrative is deployed, particularly not so much on a structural level, but deeper down on a beat by beat level to the way that other stories work. And it looks at Hamlet and Casablanca and the film version of Dr. No, and analyzes each of those moments and how they're structured. Because I have in earlier days written sort of storytelling rule sets and kind of indicated, well, at this point you just do what is interesting, or you do what it has, a sense of rising excitement to it. And it turns out that a lot of game masters don't know what that means, but a lot of people do interface with fictional forms sort of on the way they're meant to as audience members on a surface level, or rather than breaking down all the elements of storytelling in order to deploy it in their game mastering. And so Hamlet's Hit Points is about helping you internalize just all the little storytelling tricks that create emotional rhythm in order to then take that and put it back into your decision-making process as a game master, so that when a player says they want to do X, you can stop and think, well, rather than literally in a simulative level, how difficult would this be? From a dramatic point of level, how difficult should I make this in order to foster the most exciting storytelling? And sometimes the answer is, well, from a practical point of view, this task should be very difficult. But from a storytelling point of view, they should succeed at that difficult task, perhaps by paying a cost, but they shouldn't fail because it would be stupid for them to fail now, and the result would be disappointing. So that's basically that entire book, which has become weirdly popular for something apparently abstruse, is all about. So you're talking to the right person there.
I don't know. I hear a lot of things too in forums and things, and sadly, I hear some people who say that they don't feel like they're ready to run a game and things like that, even though they've played for years, or some in some cases. I ran a game the first. I played one night and then I ran my first game the next day, right? So I don't really understand that one either. But I was going to say, what are some, I don't know, maybe some myths about game mastering that you hear and you would like to just dispel for us?
Well, I think you've gotten at it already, which is just that if you haven't tried it, people think of it as a daunting thing, and the way to realize that your GM is just muddling through is to do it, and then I'm just muddling through as well. I think people are also a little intimidated by the social obligation of being the GM, because so much of it is being sort of a moderator of your social group, and sometimes a traffic cop of your group. And so often I think it's less a concern about, can I think of an interesting thing that comes next, or am I the master of this rule set, which are both issues. But I think it's also people who are kind of shy and reluctant to try to sort of dominate a room. And of course, the best way of dominating a room as a GM is in a way that it's not always apparent that you're doing so, that you have a mixture of sort of authority and give and take. And a lot of the very worst GMs are people who think they're great at it and also revel in the sense of social command that they get from the situation. So often it's, I guess if there's one word of advice, is if you're concerned whether you're going to do a good job, you're already probably a better GM than the worst GM you've had to play with who thinks he's a genius.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And if more people who were concerned about doing a good job would just realize that I don't know what I'm doing maybe half the time that I'm running a game or something like that. They just need to realize that.
Right. And on a practical level, if you're running a multiplayer game, that you always have time to think because the players spend a lot of time talking to each other. And often the easiest way to run a game is just to listen to what they say when they throw out theories of what is happening, and just pick the one that they are most alarmed by.
I think that's awesome advice. And I talk about that as well in some of the writing that I've done. It's just because I run a lot with no prep. And what I mean by no prep is usually just I have time to think about something while I'm taking a shower or driving although I don't drive anywhere now because we're still in the pandemic. But listen to what the players say at the table, they always give you way better conspiracy theories or things that would hurt them the most. They always come up with some of the great stuff at the table. And then to your point too, I think there is some intimidation for some people who, if one of the players perhaps has a strong personality and they say, no, that doesn't work that way at all, that the game master is just kind of sometimes can be worried about that situation occurring at the table.
Yeah, so sometimes when people say I'm nervous about GMing, what they really mean is I'm nervous about GMing for Pete.
No, I absolutely agree, and that's I guess that can be a tough situation. What would be your advice to that person?
If there's someone in your group who you don't want to run for, pick a different group.
Yeah, and I think that too can be difficult for people when they say, "Oh, well, it's my brother-in-law, and I can't shake him."
Well, there are very few silver linings to the pandemic, but one of them is that we've all moved to remote play. Yeah. So you can run your first game online for a group without your brother-in-law.
Yeah.
He'll never even know.
No, absolutely.
He's in Wisconsin. Well, you are too in this scenario, but still, he'll never know.
Absolutely. I think that's something else too that I totally missed about online play as well, is that you can really kind of craft your group if you're playing, if you're playing over the internet and things like that. If somebody shows up and you don't like them, you don't have to play with them.
Yeah.
And there's very little social consequence to that.
Oh, sorry, my Zoom's broken.
Yeah.
Somehow it's not recognizing your login. I don't know what happened. Sorry, Pete.
Yep. Sorry. I do want to get into some of the games that you have designed. And now you have designed so many that we can't talk about all of them. And sadly, I am not familiar with as many as I would like to be, because there's only so much time during the day, and I get to read some role-playing games, but I get to play way less of them, which is sad. But now you won a Diana Jones Award, isn't that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, and you won it for the drama system, right?
Right. So the game is packaged under the name Hillfolk, which is the sort of default kind of fantasized, if not fantastic, Iron Age setting. But it comes with many other settings written by a host of different game design writers, I think a number of whom you've had on your podcast already. And the idea of drama system is that it allows you to create something that feels like an extended cable drama and is all about interaction between different people, and particularly focused on interaction between player characters. Normally, we're familiar in role-playing with a situation where, say, archetypally, the thief says, I'm going to go and backstab those people, and the paladin says, no, you're not. And the thief says, yes, I am. And the paladin says, no, you're not. And the situation then just devolves into a stalemate. But if you watch dramatic storytelling, even characters who have a high degree of conflict, eventually some of them give in to each other about half the time. And so following the dissection of dramatic scenes that you find in Hamlet's Hit Points, Hillfolk actualizes that in order to create something with a very distributed storytelling mechanism. It still has a game moderator who plays the supporting characters in the narrative, and so plays many different characters over the course of a session or a series, and sort of engages in some very elemental traffic management. But it's a game that you literally cannot prepare for because it is so improvised and will always go in a new and different direction. So if you're looking for a game that everybody has had the experience of, we had this great session this one night where we never touched the dice and it was all just talking and interacting. And then we came back the next week and it was back to, hitting giant centipedes and rolling for initiative, and we don't know what happens. Well, a drama system is a structure that creates that dynamic so that it happens reliably every single time.
And like I said, sadly, I've only gotten to read some of Drama System. Hopefully one day I will be able to play it.
Yes, the experience of playing it is a lot of a traditional game. You can sort of get a sense of it from reading it on the page. Yeah. But the further you get from the traditional structure, the harder it is to intuit from reading the rules what play is actually like.
I did want to talk about another one of your game systems, Gumshoe. I'd like if you could to kind of explain kind of the problem that Gumshoe is trying to solve in role-playing games. There seems to be occasionally a problem whenever you are looking for clues in some role-playing games. How does Gumshoe? What is Gumshoe, and then how does it address that?
So the basic idea behind Gumshoe is that it's never interesting to fail to get information, and so the problem that it's meant to address is the one that classically comes up, say, for example, in Call of Cthulhu, where the GM needs to get the characters to go to the swamp to find the ghoul crypt. And the professor character goes to the library to find the map that has the crucial clue that tells them that they need to go to the swamp. And traditionally, you roll your library use. And sometimes in basic role-playing, you have a really low ability. You fail a lot in that game system. But let's say you even have an 80% chance of success, but you roll your percentile die and you get over 80. Well, then all of a sudden, you are stopped dead, or rather the GM then has to spend 20 minutes improvising some other way to get you to the swamp. And as in the old joke, Doc, it hurts when I do this, Doc, and then the doctor says, well, then don't do that. Gumshoe says, don't do that. You do everything the same. You have the library use ability. You go to the library, but instead of rolling to see if you get to see the map and go to the swamp, you automatically succeed. And that's basically it. And some people will argue that, well, that problem never happens. And, well, that's funny because people come up to me all the time and tell me their stories of games that literally stopped at the starting point because someone failed a scan roll. So it does happen to a lot of people a lot of times. And what they really mean is we do the 20 minutes of faffing around. Well, if you take that out, you can then build a much richer, more interesting, more detailed mystery that's about way more than just leading the characters from point A to point B to point C, but one in which they have more choices and one in which they have a lot of information put together, and it becomes more like a real mystery, either a real fictional mystery in a novel or actual police work, in which the question is not how do we get the very few clues that lead us through a linear narrative, but how do we figure out what's going on from this mass of undifferentiated information. Now, there are situations where it is just as interesting to fail as to succeed. For example, when you're running away from the ghouls once you get to the crypt, or you're trying to restart the car that they damaged, or you are attempting to determine whether or not you brought the right ghoul fighting equipment. And in that case, you have general abilities, and you're rolling a die, a regular D6, and you're hoping to beat a difficulty number, and that's usually a 4, but can be higher. The twist, though, is that with each ability that you're particularly good in, you have a pool of points that you can spend as positive modifiers to that roll to control when it is that you're most likely to succeed. And so then the question becomes, is this the moment when I most need to use those crucial points of fleeing or preparation, or am I going to need them later? Is this the moment I really care about? And it's less about parceling out literally your ability in something with rather your spotlight time as a character, so that everybody gets moments to shine in ways that is predefined as being connected with their specialties. And so the first Gumshoe game was the Esoterrorists, which is sort of a mixture of sort of Tom Clancy-esque techno-thriller or CSI investigation, plus horrible demons in a modern-day environment. So you're super competent agents up against the occult. There's Fear itself, which is ordinary people in horror situations. The game that really sort of clicked Gumshoe for a lot of people is Kenneth Haight's Trail of Cthulhu, which is his adaptation of the classic Call of Cthulhu game to the Gumshoe system. He also has Night's Black Agents, which is a modern-day spies versus vampires thriller game. Ashen Stars is my space opera game. There's Mutant City Blues, which is a superhero police procedural. It's coming out in a new edition soon. And my newest Gumshoe game is the Yellow King role-playing game, which is a big, epic, reality-shifting game based on the stories of Robert W. Chambers and his King in Yellow mythos.
I can't understand people saying that they don't ever run into that problem of the players, not needing a clue or not needing a piece of information to lead to more like a more interesting or more exciting outcome, because it just happens all the time. It just happened to me the other night when we were running a game, right? The players open a chest, there's nothing in it. They just leave it. Well, there's a false bottom in the chest. And it would be really cool if they found that false bottom. So I have to give them a few extra little clues to get them to even check for a false bottom, right?
The original design conception that led to what I think is dysfunctional play is in D&D, often informational abilities were about finding stuff. Yeah. And if you don't find the treasure behind the door, well, that kind of sucks for you, but it doesn't stop anything from happening. It's, and the treasure is sort of incidental to your fun. Whereas when that idea of rolling for information was then ported to other games, it could then be applied to things that would prevent interesting or fun things from happening, and not just prevent things that allow the story to move forward. That's the most extreme case, but also it's a question of the boring result, as you suggest, versus the interesting result. And we should always be moving toward what is interesting and moving away from that which is boring.
If the player's enjoyment of the session or something hinges on them finding a scrap of piece of paper with a name and a little note on it or something like that, not giving that to them just seems like you need to run a new adventure or something. It's just like you've just stopped that adventure, or, that whatever they're involved with right there, that investigation, you just stopped it dead. They need that one little piece of information, and they forget to check the bottom of the chest or whatever it is. Sadly, again, since I am not been able to play Gumshoe yet, but I have bought Ashen Stars and I have read through the book. Hopefully, I'll be able to put together a session here soon at the time of recording. I still haven't been able to play, which is kind of frustrating to me because it looks very interesting. I was just wondering, for the listeners out there, what were some of your inspirations for Ashen Stars when you were creating that setting?
The sort of key point, which came from a writer on gaming called Alex Johnston, who's a member of my group for a while, is that Star Trek is a police procedural show, that it's a mystery show. And it is about investigating a situation. And often the initial thing that seems to be going on is not the thing that's going on. And then they figure out what's going on. And then the thing that then differentiates Star Trek from other cop shows is that then there's a moral dilemma that needs to be resolved. And so with that in mind, I wanted to create something that was a tribute to the various great TV, in particular, space opera properties, because they all kind of worked in that direction to various extents. Some of them have more kind of intrigue in them. But again, political intrigue is all about finding what's going on and encountering the problem and then figuring out what to do with it. And so the idea then was to create sort of something that, what if there was a gritty reboot of the more kind of hopeful, upbeat 70s or 80s show? And so the idea is that the vast interstellar civilization has experienced a big setback after war, and there's a big, their outer edge of their empire, they can no longer afford to police. And so they set up a system where independent contractors called lasers investigate problems on a freelance basis. And so what that does is it removes the traditional problem of playing space opera games, which is the military or police-style command structure, and puts the problems in the hands of a non-hierarchical small group of oddballs. And that's your role-playing party, right? And so that gets away from the problem of one of the players is playing the captain and the other is playing the second in command, and the others have to kind of obey their orders, which is always a drag for the people who have to both obey the orders and also for those who have to give the orders, because they have more responsibility than most players actually want. And again, the players who want that responsibility are the ones who often shouldn't have it. And interestingly, since I wrote Ashen Stars, we have Picard, the new Star Trek show that takes the beloved, somewhat stodgy and positive 80s show and not only makes it gritty and dark, but posits that there's an area of interstellar space where authority has collapsed and interstellar freelancers, including 7 of 9, are now going around solving problems on a contract basis. So thanks, Michael Chabon, for making my example of Ashen Stars even more accessible to people.
I was actually thinking about that. My wife and I watched Picard recently, and I was like, well, Ashen Stars, the TV show.
Yep.
Yeah, like I said, hopefully here, I should be running my first few sessions here of Ashen Stars. I'm still hoping, still fingers crossed. Hopefully that'll be soon. Do you have any tips or anything for maybe a first-time GM of Ashen Stars?
I think it just basically makes sure that the players have the freedom to feel competent and that there's a reason why they are out there solving problems. And the thing that Ashen Stars does in particular is it confronts them with a moral cost for being the typical group of corner-cutting, somewhat skeevy player characters. And so their ethical decisions matter and their reputation goes down, and there's a whole mechanical system for that, if they act like typical murder hobos with a spaceship. And so the tip is to always make sure that they have that opportunity to confront a moral choice, but that they're not punished, but are rather rewarded for making the decision that Picard and Data and Riker would make without batting an eye to do the right thing.
That's helpful. Now, also recently, Pelgrane Press has released community content rules for creating Ashen Stars content. I was just wondering if there's something that you would like to see created by some community creators that would really kind of add to the Ashen Stars experience.
Well, the great thing about community content is it allows you to do sort of smaller bore things that people can immediately pick up at a low price point that are extremely useful to them. And for Ashen Stars, I think that would be elements that you can just pick up and plug into a scenario either that you're improvising or that is written but has gone in an unexpected direction. So just a list of planets and the ethical dilemmas and strange mysteries that are on those planets. A book of space station game master characters who you would bump into and why they don't want to talk to you even though they don't actually are not actually the bad guy of the mission, why they seem suspicious or why they might be helpful. And for that, you might want to take a look at the Trail of Cthulhu campaign I did called the Armitage Files, which sets up characters in a format that makes them useful for improvised play because it gives them both a sinister and a stalwart version so that the GM can immediately use them for whatever purpose she needs them for. So all sorts of sort of plug and play things that aren't necessarily connected to an adventure, but you can insert into your own improvised experience. So for example, you mentioned that you like to work without a lot of pre-planning. And so something like that would be really great if you need all of a sudden a dealer in salvaged starship parts and you don't have one in the adventure, then you just pick up the book of skeevy game master characters and someone has provided one for you ready to go. So little elements like that I think would be a strong element that I think a lot of people don't really consider doing, but would be the most useful thing to do.
Thank you. That was great advice. Now, you've also recently been working on a Gumshoe One-to-One. Could you explain that just a little bit?
So the first version of that is in Cthulhu Confidential. I designed the rules for that and the scenario in Los Angeles setting for the typical LA detective Dex Raymond. Ruth Tillman and Chris Spivey created their own characters as well, so that we have a diverse array of characters to choose from. There's Chris's character is Langston Wright, and he is an African-American war veteran working in Washington, D.C. During the war. And Ruth Tillman's character, Vivian Sinclair, is a reporter in New York. And so the idea behind this is that you have a set character that you sometimes flesh out, sometimes more than others. And the experience of playing is very different because you are the one player. You don't have others to shoot ideas off of. You're always in center stage. Your sense of being in a dangerous world alone is more acute. And it's also more intense for the GM because you don't have the time to improvise that we were talking about earlier, but where the players are conversing and you're sort of sitting back figuring out what to do next. And so One-to-One provides a different rule system for the general abilities that contains the outcomes of challenges so that the story still has a chance of extraordinary or middling or success or failure, all of which are interesting in different ways, but that never result in a completely unexpected outcome that takes you totally outside of the parameters of the adventure in a way that requires you to improvise and sort of get lost. And so the idea is to create something that feels more like being in a mystery novel than the sort of typical meandering role-playing session with all sorts of false ends and so forth. So it's more intense for both parties, but also much more rewarding. And even before, it's often the case that you have one person to play with, or often we find a lot of people are introducing their significant other to role-playing through Gumshoe One-to-One. And now you may have only one other player in your quarantine situation. So it's even more ideal now than when they designed it. There's a second one-to-one game called Knights Black Agent Solo Ops. That's Gareth Ryder Hanrahan's adaptation of the one-to-one format to the even trickier genre of the spy thriller, because ultra-competent spies have many more things that they can do in a situation, often involving possibly blowing things up. And so Gar had to create another set of guardrails to allow you to feel free and hyper competent, but again, remaining within the expected parameters of the limits of your improvisation.
I think that is an interesting take on the gaming, because I know, at least for me, a lot of times growing up, I had, if one friend came over to spend the night, especially when we were teenagers and stuff, we always tried to role play, but having a rule system actually geared to that does seem like it is solving a problem that could exist. And of course, yes, if we're quarantined and you only have one other person there, introduce them to a game. One of your recent, very large works is the Yellow King role-playing game. Can you tell us a bit about that?
So this is based not only on the 4 very influential horror stories written by Robert W. Chambers in 1895, but on my own book, New Tales of the Yellow Sign, which is an anthology of original short fiction that expands on the horror ideas and the idea of reality horror in particular that is found in Chambers. And so Kat and Simon at Pelgrane asked me to adapt that into a role-playing game, and the result is the Yellow King role-playing game, which is 6 beautiful pounds of ambitious role-playing excitement. It's 4 books in a beautiful 2-part magnetic slipcase that unfolds into a pair of GM info screens. And the idea is that you play 4 sets of characters over 4 realities that evolve over time, and the characters are all interrelated to one another in various ways. The first one is called Paris, and that is a cult adventure in 1895 Belle Epoque Paris, which is one of the most exciting and glamorous periods in history. The next one is The Wars, which takes place in an alternate reality continental war in 1947 Europe, where there are weird Jules Verne-style war machines stomping across the battlefield, and you are soldiers in this conflict, but you are ineluctably drawn into the weird mysteries that are going on in the background, because the strange nobles of this other supernatural world, Carcosa, seem to be manipulating events in order to basically have a giant chess game across Europe with real people as the stakes. And then there's Aftermath, which takes the events of these Chambers story, Repairer of Reputations, as if the story came out the other way, wasn't a hallucination, and 100 years later, the supernaturally backed dictatorship that has ruled America has been overthrown, and your player characters are some of the ex-insurgents who took the regime down. You're trying to get back to your normal life, or perhaps rebuild the world, America's politics after 100 years of dictatorship. But again, there's still weird mysteries in the corners that you wind up being drawn into. And then the final one is called This Is Normal Now, which you play the same characters in another reality, a reality that seems initially much like our own absolutely normal oh, wait a minute. Oh no, reality isn't normal at all, is it?
I mean, that's just fascinating. And as you mentioned, very ambitious that so it is taking, like, you play the same characters just in different realities.
In the second two cases, you're literally the same characters. But the first set of characters in Paris, you then in the wars establish what your connection is to them. So you might just have one own the diary of your previous character. You might be the grandchild of that character. You might be that same character who's become an immortal vampire. Whatever it is you decide to have the connection to. So there's the things that happen in the earlier installments keep having different kinds of callbacks. So you might run into the same antagonist again, an immortal vampire perhaps, or something else throughout the course of the series. But at any rate, there's always times when you're remembering and amplifying what happened before. So in a sense, the later sequences, you're encountering Easter eggs that refer back not to some other pop culture property, but to the earlier part of this multi-part series.
It uses like an adaptive Gumshoe system?
Yeah, so this is a new iteration of Gumshoe that introduces, it's called the Quick Shock system. In this system, emotional and physical damage are represented by shock and injury cards. And so rather than just losing a set number of health points or stability points, if something bad happens to you, you have a card that represents the condition you have that has some sort of penalty, usually some sort of drawback. For example, you might suffer a penalty to all of your presence abilities. And it has also a discard condition that shows you what you have to do to get rid of the card. For example, discard the next time you go and talk to someone nobody else wants to talk to, or the next time you move into a new creepy location. Or, you can, in the case of many injuries, it's just a matter of you then get first aid from another character, for example. And so, and if you get too many injury cards, your character dies and leaves play. If you get too many shock cards, you are too mentally shattered to continue. And so the idea there is that you are aware of how many cards you have, you're worried about them, and they have a lingering effect on play. And so they're fun to get, they're fun to get rid of, they're memorable while you have them. And so it is much less abstract and more narrative focused than your standard, I lost 4 hit points.
I've had you on here a long time already. Where can people find out more about your work and find you online?
You can find me on Twitter, and it's at Rodin D Laws. You can head on over to the Pelgrane website, pelgranepress.com. You can go to your podcast app of choice and search for Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff for the weekly podcast that I do with Kenneth Haidt. You can head over to the Patreon to support Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff. So you can just search for that on Patreon. And pelgranepress.com has a drama system and Gumshoe. It has most of the books that we've talked about this session, and Hamlet's Hit Points, and my book that is just about creating standard narratives, beating the story, is available from a Game Playwright. You can find that at gameplaywright.net, or you can purchase it on Amazon or DriveThru or wherever else you're purchasing your books from these days.
Okay, and then I will make sure that I will put links in the show notes for this episode to your books and to your games so that people can find them very easy. So if you are listening to this podcast right now, you can just head over to dicegeeks.com, find the show notes for this episode, and I will have links to Robin's books as well as some of his games, and you can check those out. And of course, I will include a link to Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff, which is an outstanding podcast, which I am a proud patron of. So I will include a link there too, so you can find out more about what Robin is up to. Well, Robin, I could go on asking you a ton more questions about writing and role-playing games and everything like that, but I will respect your time. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
You're most welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, well, there you have it, guys. Oh, man, it was just a pleasure to interview Robin. Hopefully, I have not scared him off with my naive and ill-formed questions, and I really hope you enjoyed this conversation today. As I mentioned in the podcast, I have provided links to Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff, Robin's podcast, as well as the Pelgrane Press website where you can find a lot of Robin's games. And also, I have provided a few links to individual titles where you can pick those up and check out Robin's work. Trust me, you want to do that. All right. If you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And in addition to that, you will get an email update every Friday letting you know what is going on in the Dice Geeks universe. You don't want to be left out, guys. Now, hey, guys, if you enjoy this show, please consider supporting it in some way. You can tell a friend, you can leave a review, you can subscribe. You can also head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks and support the show financially there. That would mean the world to me. I also create tabletop RPG resource books. You can find those at amazon.com, drivethrurpg.com, and my website, dicegeeks.com. If you just go on Amazon or drivethrurpg and just type in Dice Geeks, all one word, you'll be able to find some cool resources to help you run better games. Now, guys, I thank you so much for listening, and until next time, keep gaming.